Para situar essa minha fala final, eu gostaria de compartilhar com vocês um episódio um tanto pessoal, porque eu acho que é a partir dele que é a ideia desse workshop, ela começa a ser pensada, a ser elaborada.
To be thought. One of the activities I developed here at the University of York involved following João in his interaction with students in the course of the Politics and Health Emergencies. And throughout those interactions in which we discussed and so the theoretical analytical perspectives regarded as fundamental in critical global health studies, such as securitization, vulnerability, neglect, risk, and taking, in many cases, the COVID-19 pandemic, I shared with João some of the questions that prompted my readings, and particularly how would be the implications of framing climate change, biodiversity loss and emergencies, and above all, whether this framing would have any way to drive transformative actions, to reframe and to understand the sustainability in its practices. From these initial conversations to the realization of this webinar, many elements come together. First, reading the article by Lucy McHugh and Maria Carmen Lemos and Tiffany Morrison entitled Risk, Crisis, Emergency, Implications of the New Climate Emergency Framing for Governance and Policy. Afterwards, a coffee with Pierre and White, where we could talk about our research and about the desire to go ahead with this workshop, where we could provoke innovative and instigating discussion about emergencies. Pierre, very generous and excited with the idea, suggested reading another article, very much in line with the discussions provoked here today, by James Patterson and collaborators, and together, over the past 2 months, we designed the proposal for this workshop, the sections that were composed of debates, the participants that would invite, based on their empirical analytical experiences, to a plurality of ideas and diversity that we would like to contemplate, particularly the relevance of being able to hold a bilingual event with simultaneous translation that would foster dialogues and interaction between colleagues that act in different researches in Brazil and England, and to the perspective of expanding collaborations in a symmetric relationship. Now, after listening carefully to my colleagues and taking notes of some points, I share with you a synthesis of what I elaborate, and some needs, and maybe this is not going to do justice with the richness of the reflections we had today. First, I think it was very clear that we recognize that there are distinct understandings of the concept of emergency. The definitions are more linked to crisis, and like Sarah said, that we have a different concept in the perspective of submergence. So you don't have to, we have a very deep impact, and they create continuous opportunities and more vulnerability, and many times they are hidden, and obviously they have some kind of resistance. And also we have the narrative of the catastrophes is also embedded in this framework. The COVID-19, like many colleagues said, it taught us many lessons. First, that you can think to face all these challenges in the future, we have to understand the emergency is not enough to motivate the existence of result. The pandemic showed us that we didn't really get to discern of the concept. And like Mariana said, even this perspective of learning, one of the most important things is to discuss and to prevent, to cope with future pandemics. And those costs is going to be much smaller than the cost of after the pandemic existed. So we have many robust scientific research, but the actions, individual or collectives or politicals, are very slow. And the answers to face this pandemic, when the perspective of Mariana and others, maybe they are not going to be sufficient. And the economy, like Paul said, but it's very optimistic to deal with these problems, and probably is going to be achieved by innovation. The problem of the emergency framework can be seen as just a quick answer for the problems. The developments in science, the hope of change of behavior, and like Gail said, we have to have some transversal way of thinking that this is not going to cause immediate disruption, but have a very important role in questions like colonialism, social justice. So they are fundamental for this debate. And think who is going to benefit for this framework of emergency, which kind of impacts we have. And thinking about all this, we know of the challenges of the transposition that we have when you deal about emergency of health, public health, makes us think in two important points. Yes, the rules, international rules, and the deals that are made, international deals and agreements, are very important to forward the results, and it's very important to protect the human rights, but you also have to look at the emergencies of the human rights. And the perspective of actions that we have to recognize and to care about are two different things. So we have to think about framework is to go beyond the limitations, and you have a conception and also different ways. And like Renzo said, indigenous communities have to be a fundamental part of this. And we're talking about indigenous leadership, like Janaka said, this is the moment to break this kind of separation. You have to think about a common answer, and this, you have to empower the nature, and you need the cooperation, efforts, and to bring to the debate social justice and environmental justice. And finally, I would like to talk about the political influences and also the limitations of groups, of communities that are already in a vulnerable position. They are having a greater impact in the way that they respond for the impacts of so this window is very small. The idea of time is also goes back to what Peter said, that talks about how can this emergency framework can limit the alternatives. So questions of this alternatives of a scenery that with loads of ethical problems and many limitations, and to exclusion of diversity. And to think about this framing is fundamental. The answers that we put in those kind of situations, like John said, through his experience, you have to consider the local specifications, the answers for the disaster. Those are very important. And finally, Elena brings two proposals of coordinated answers to interconnect, to be more effective, and to dealing with the emergency and crisis. and also take in consideration the war and also the diversity and the destruction of the ecosystem. And considering questions like vulnerability, social justice, environmental justice, and the efforts of restoration. So I'd like to wrap up, remembering that in our dialogues, we talk clearly about the potential of this framing of emergency in the field of global health. And I think to understand that emergency is a concept and is open to threats, and the threats are shared and with the decision makers. And if this framing has a space, I think it could accommodate the discourse and to reinforce the insustainability of the status quo. I think that in the global health, this perspective that we call the constructivist approach can create a much more robust analysis that more than a health challenge. The emergency has to be understood based on a context that requires mobilization of the states, mobilization of society to be able to fight the socio-economical problems that are the basis of these problems, prioritizing the creativity, creative responses, and trying to understand how the multiple dynamics and can constitute the central emergency, being a very important factor with the production of vulnerability. And I give João the floor. Thank you once again, the acceptance of all the panelists today.
Thanks, Gabriela. Obrigado. It was a brilliant summary. Thank you. Am I still the chair here? I don't know. I don't know whether who's chairing or whether we're just free floating now. We still have a couple of minutes, so I would like to hand over to Piran. Piran, any final comments?
Thank you, João. Thank you, Gabriela. That was a wonderful summary, as João said. Thank you very much. You had quite a hard task to do all that in a limited time, so thank you. I just wanted to finish by thanking a few people, really. So particularly, I wanted to thank Elizabeth Lancel and Lydia Harris from IGDC for organising the webinar, which was actually quite an enormous task. It's almost a conference rather than a webinar with so many different speakers, and Elizabeth and Lydia contacted all the speakers, liaised with them, provided really accurate instructions, got everything sorted out beforehand, arranged translations, organised everything on the day. So we're really grateful to them for all their hard work, and also to Jane Gulech from YESI, who provided lots of support throughout and on the day as well. So lots of thanks to those people. I'd like to thank Carla and Flavia, our translators, for a wonderful job, and hopefully we didn't go too fast most of the time for you. So thank you very much for all your work. I'd like to thank the panelists again for some very stimulating talks, and I'd like to thank everyone else for coming and for all your entries in the Q&A and the chat and your contributions to the discussions. As Lydia has said in the chat, we have been making recordings in both English and Portuguese, and we'll be sending the link to all people who have registered. If you haven't signed up to, and you're interested to sign up to either IGDC or YESI or both in terms of hearing about future events, please do so. We're planning to hold many more events during the year to come. And now we've managed to do one with simultaneous translation as well. I imagine this will be the first of many that will run in the future too. So do keep an eye out and sign up, and it would be great to see you at future events as well. So that's all I wanted to say. So just thank you very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting. And I hope that it will be the starting point for different ways of thinking about some of these things, and also potentially with some of the participants, potential collaborations in the future, which we can follow up in due course. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Boa
Thank
tarde a
you.
todos.
Boa tarde. Thank you.